So Rabbi Held has written a remarkable book in which he advances an argument that seems counterintuitive not only to non-Jews who have bought the kind of classical division that some other religion is the religion of love and we're the religion of law or judgment or whatever, but I know a lot of Jews who think that too, and who think of the portrayal of God and of Jewish values in our classical texts as harsh and judgmental and angry. And that's not something people make up. There's enough evidence for that if you look for it. But it's not how people who are cozy on the inside see those texts when they read them. And what Rabbi Held has done is to boldly place himself in the middle, to speak the love on the inside to those who are either on the margins struggling, or who have been shoved outside, or who are just from another tradition. And he musters a considerable amount of evidence to talk about the many ways that Judaism not only talks the talk of love, but implements love, so that love becomes for us not just an emotion, it becomes an agenda. And anyone who has ever been in an actual loving relationship knows that love that is merely articulated is hurtful and offensive and wounding, but that love that's never articulated feels like a political campaign. And to be able to integrate the love of our heart with the love of our hands, of our deeds, of our actions, that's really the work of Judaism. So I want to turn it over to my friend Rabbi Held to talk to us about the argument of this remarkable book and what does love have to do with it.
Thank you, Brad. First of all, I'm really just grateful and glad to be here. It's also always fun to sit surrounded by two people you adore, so it's really a thrill to be up here. Thank you all for making the time to be here. Thank you, Brad, for reading the script just as I gave it to you. So I want to share an experience that I talk about in the opening pages of this book, because when I look back now, I realize that that experience shaped much of what I've done over the last 25 years, even though I would be lying if I said I knew at the moment that it would be formative. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. I am standing in front of a group of fifth-year students at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and in passing, in the midst of a discussion, I say, Judaism is the story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. And one of the students somewhat sneeringly says, I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me. And I was like really taken aback, a little bit crestfallen. And I said to him, you know, it's so interesting to me that that's your response, because I was actually thinking of the morning and evening liturgy. We do say, after all, Ahava rabbah ahavtanu, with vast love have you loved us, and then immediately recite Deuteronomy chapter 6, Ve'avta et Hashem Elohecha, and you should love the Lord your God. In other words, a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. So if I say that and you hear Christianity, it turns out there's a conversation we need to have about how deeply many Jews, even many Jews who consider themselves on the inside, how deeply we've internalized a traditional Christian anti-Judaic idea, right? There is a tremendous amount of damage that we have to undo. And you know, it's only in recent years that I've started reading some social scientists and philosophers about, and I'm embarrassed at how naive I was about this, about just how frequently and how deeply minority groups often come to see themselves through the eyes of the majority group, even when the majority group sees them in the most pejorative ways. And I think you have that in the history of Judaism. In a very fundamental way, Jews internalized the story Christians told about us. So that's one piece. And I want to share another story that I really regret I didn't include in this book. In retrospect, I really should have, which is that a few months after that, I was speaking to a group of Protestant high school students. And in passing, in the middle of a class, I said, "So guys, remind me, what does Jesus say is the great command?" And all 20 students raised their hand. I call on one of them, and he proudly tells me about love of God and love of neighbor. And then innocently, I say, "And remind me, what is Jesus quoting?" Not a single hand goes up. Not a single hand goes up. The answer, by the way, is Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? And I realized in that moment, well, this is how Christian communities have been able to tell a story about Judaism as a loveless religion. That is, that they're never taught what wells Jesus drank from. Where did he get the love? Isn't that also a song? Where is the love, right? I mean, they're never taught. Brad and I are going to perform later. You can all leave before that happens. So, you know, in many ways, those two experiences, this book is an attempt to address both of those experiences because my primary audience is Jews. In an attempt at reclamation of what I think lies at the heart of the Jewish tradition. And I mean heart here in both senses of that word, heart as in core and heart as in heart. Secondarily, my audience, I hope, is also Christians, because I continue to be incredibly moved by the number of Christians I meet who say things like, "I know what I was taught in Sunday school or seminary is obsolete and offensive, and that I should think and talk in different ways about Judaism, but I don't know what to say." And my hope is that in some small way, this book might be a resource also for Christians who want to think about Judaism in a more robust, more full, more respectful kind of way. You know, I do want to make the observation, because I have found this really striking, that this internalization of the idea that Judaism is not about love really cuts across denominational lines in ways that continue to surprise me, because I feel like there are a lot of things I encounter as a teacher that, I find this in an Orthodox community, I find that in a Reform community. This is true across the board. I've gotten versions of this response from rabbinical students at HUC and from students at Hesder Yeshivot in Israel, and right, it's a deeply internalized bias, and sometimes it's so internalized that it even becomes something people boast about, right? And so it's very, very important to me that we try to begin to heal this. Now, just to complicate the picture a little bit, I think there's also a dimension here of what American Jews did to ourselves, because at a certain point in American Jewish history, I am not a historian, I'm certainly not a historian of education, but I think it was probably in the years after World War II, where Jews who were very anxious about assimilating, but didn't know that much about Judaism, began to define their Judaism as whatever they imagined Christianity was not. So because they imagined that Christianity was about love, they began to proudly say, and Judaism is about justice, or Judaism is about law. The most dramatic example of this, which I think sort of proves the point, is the bizarre fact that generations of Hebrew school students in America have been taught that Judaism has no notion of the afterlife, right? This is entirely and 100% false. But it happened because in American Jews' not very rich understanding of Christianity, Christianity is entirely about the afterlife. Therefore, we don't believe in the afterlife. So now when you think about this, it's a kind of double whammy, because on the one hand, you have the majority culture telling you that you're loveless. And on the other hand, you have your own culture trying to differentiate itself from that culture that's telling you that it's about love and you're not. So on some level you say, yeah, we're not about love, we're about other things. This makes a big mess of the Jewish tradition. And honestly, you know, it's funny because when I started working on this book, there were people who said to me, this is a big task you've taken on. And I thought to myself, it's funny, it doesn't feel like a big task. It feels like the pshat, the plain sense meaning of the most foundational texts of the Jewish tradition. It only feels like a massive task because of this narrative that we've sold ourselves and that we've been sold. I want to let me say one other thing, and then we can have a real conversation about this. What do I mean by love? Is that a song?
It could be.
Why don't you write one in the meantime? What do I mean? What do I mean by love? And here, this is actually, I think, important, and I'll in a minute I'll try to get to why this is so important to me to say. Love, as I think the Jewish tradition uses it, and certainly, maybe more modestly, the way I'm using it, love is not primarily an emotion. It has emotional aspects, but it is something more fundamental than an emotion. It is an orientation. It is a way of holding ourselves in the world. The term that I coined, I'm embarrassed by its pretentiousness, but it really helped me in my own thinking. Love is an existential posture. It's a way of holding ourselves in the world. Now, you can't have a posture if it doesn't at times manifest in emotion. But it itself is not an emotion. It's rather a disposition to feel certain ways and act in certain ways. Now, why am I saying this? Why is this important? I don't think I talk about this in the book, but I should have. My editor insisted I talk about less, not more. He only partially succeeded. I think that when you tell people, actually, no, let me back up and say this differently. You cannot build a spiritual life on a feeling, because as anyone who's sentient knows, feelings come and go, right? You can meditate for 15 seconds and it'll be the first thing you discover. Wait a minute ago I was feeling happy, now I'm ruining the day I was born. What just happened, right? I've heard about this. I don't know, but I've heard about it. So you can't build a spiritual life on an emotion, because that means that 1 minute I have a spiritual life and 1 minute I don't. That can't be right. Instead, you can build a spiritual life on a posture or an orientation. And this is really important, because this is the thing that I should have written about in the book, I think, is that if you tell people that the spiritual life depends or is built on an emotion, one of two things happen. Either people begin to lie to themselves and they say, oh, all I ever feel is love. This may be a little bit of an insider comment, but you know there's a guy in like every happy, clappy kind of davening crowd. The guy who's like, hey, brother, I'm all about love. And meanwhile, they're like a simmering pot of rage, right? But they don't know that, because after all, they've internalized a story where they have to be loving all the time. So you cultivate the false self, or, I didn't mean to out you, Brad.
I know that the minute you said that, Rabbi Brous was going through the roster of IKAR, and I was thinking of my rabbinical students. So good.
The other possibility is that people just give up, because they say, I can't do that. So here's another example of this, if this is helpful. About 15 years ago, this is actually true, I went and took out of the library, I ordered to the library every self-help book on gratitude that had been written in the last 25 years. And then I regretted that I didn't own a wheelbarrow, right? So I'm sitting and paging through these books. I can't say I read them all. But one of the things that really struck me is how many of these books say our goal should be to feel grateful all the time. And I remember thinking, that is totally wrong. What about when what I feel is grief? I don't know, as a Jew, the last 7 months, my primary feelings have been grief and indignation. But if you ask me, am I oriented towards gratitude, I would still say, I try to be, yes. It's not my feeling tone at this moment, but it's still fundamental. And so the paradox is that when you talk about love as an orientation, on the one hand, you're actually laying out something that is very difficult. It's the task of a lifetime in many ways. But on the other hand, you're giving people permission to feel what they feel, rather than having to force themselves to pretend to feel something at all times. I'll give one other example of this, because my wife is currently on the other coast, so I don't feel nervous about sharing this. Marital love. Marriage is not built on the feeling of love. Marriage is built on the orientation of love, which again has to crystallize into emotion some of the time, but doesn't. It's not. If you call me on a Tuesday afternoon and say, Shai, what are the 3 primary things you're feeling right now? I'm madly in love with my wife is not always in the top 3. Sometimes it's like I'm grumpy, I'm angry at whoever invented email. I have there's all kinds of stuff. But if you ask me, what's your posture? I would say loving my wife is the most important thing in my life. She's the most important person to me. There's no contradiction there. It's just, I think, a more sophisticated way, or maybe a more mature way of thinking about love. So, this book, I tried to sort of explore Judaism's various love commandments. I could talk about what those are later, perhaps. But I try to do it in a way that can make sense of the fleetingness of human experience. Hasidic rabbis like to call this hachayot ratzo vashov, right? Like 1 minute I feel totally connected, 1 minute I feel completely alienated. That doesn't mean I'm not loving, it doesn't mean I'm not grateful, quite the contrary. It means that those are my postures, and I return to them as an orientation, but they're not synonymous with feelings.
Thank you for that. That is just a dip into the beginning, but I want to turn to my colleague and friend, Rabbi Brous, and someone in this room may not yet know that Rabbi Brous also just wrote a book, wonderful book, and it does seem to me that they're about related topics, that the Amen effect actually is a similar thesis. So I would love to hear you reflect on how this percolates through the Amen effect as well.
Okay, first of all, it's great joy to have you all here in our home at IKAR. And this is exactly why we have this space, so that we can have conversations like this, and it's wonderful to be together in this way. And I'm so honored to be seated next to 2 of my very dear friends and teachers, and 2 of the people, 2 of the teachers of our time who've really given us access to Jewish theology. This is a gift that you have given us, a way of understanding ourselves in relationship with the divine. And I think it's changed my life in very profound ways. And I know for many people that's true. So I will say, as I was reading your book, I was so excited, and I was trying to use different color tabs every time there was something that I felt when I put my book into the world. I had this fantasy that one day Amazon would say, recommended by together these 2 books. And so that mine would be kind of a practitioner's version of and yours would offer the deep theological foundation for what I'm offering in mine. And I did feel that as I was reading you. And it's not by accident, because we've been friends for so many years. And I think the heart of my theology was really established when we were in rabbinical school together. One of the chapters of my book, I talk about an encounter that I had in chapter 3 after a terrible storm that tore through New York State, when my husband and I were out camping. And it was a kind of near-death experience. And then in the morning, when we made it back to New York City, we encountered this terrible news story about a tragedy that happened in the Bronx, not far from where we were, where somebody actually died in that storm. And I developed a relationship with the woman, the bereaved mother of the young woman who died. After I met this woman and talked to her, and we became close, she's the one who offered the words that kind of cracked the code for me. She said to me, she was telling me that she had received an offer from the city of New York, from the attorney, essentially putting a very low price on the value of her daughter's life. And she said to that lawyer, you have no idea who my daughter could have been in this world. I will see your ass in court. And I remember going to talk to Shai about it, because I was so blown away by this. And Shai's like, oh my God, that's just like the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. I'm like, what Mishnah and Sanhedrin? And Shai said, seriously, you don't know? And he sat me down and what?
I really said that?
You really said that. And sat me down and was like, this text will change your life forever. And it did. And so it's not accidental that we're all sort of driven by the same ideas, that human beings created in God's own image deserve to live in dignity. Or you might not say deserve, because I know grace is a little bit about being undeserving of the gift of life, which we want to get to in a moment. But I'm so moved by the force of your argument, and I want to ask you, if we can, as we begin to dive into this, so much of the love that you are arguing about as the foundation of this theology is really theological. It's rooted in God's love for us. And I know that we have lots of people in our Jewish communities who love Judaism and love each other and don't love God. They don't know if they have any relationship with God, or if God even exists. And so I wonder if you could start by addressing this, because if the foundation for our orientation in life as a loving orientation is rooted in God's love of us, and therefore the obligation to share love with the world, how do you speak to Jews who aren't sure about the God piece?
I love softballs. So let me start by just taking a couple of sentences to develop where you started. One of the things that has been very important to me to argue is that each of us, simply by dint of being created by God in God's image, is infinitely valuable and loved. And that means that we don't have to spend our life trying to earn our worth, which is a fool's errand in any case. But rather, we strive to live up to a worth that we always already have. That is, in my view, a totally revolutionary view, and it has the potential to really cut against the crazed culture of competitiveness and comparison that so dominates our lives. Because what happens so often is that people purchase their self-worth, or really the illusion of self-worth, by kind of making invidious comparisons with other people. You know, I give the sort of silly example in the book of, you know, I'm walking down the street, I'm feeling really horrible about myself, and then I think, okay, I may be worthless, but I'm smarter than she is, and I'm better looking than he is, right? And so I tell myself that now I have self-worth. But in fact, all I've gotten is fool's gold. Because what will happen the next moment is I'll meet someone who I think is more successful than me or smarter than I am. One of the reasons that the culture of academia is so toxic, I think, is because you have so many people whose identity and sense of their worth is based on the idea that they're brilliant. And then they meet someone who they worry is more brilliant than they, and so they have to eat them alive, right? You see this all the time in academic contexts. And I'm sort of playing with the idea that if we can sort of take seriously and internalize the idea that worth is something we always already have, we can actually genuinely be generous to other people and not need them to fail. Genuine self-worth makes Schadenfreude gratuitous, right? I don't need you to fail to feel good about myself. I feel good about myself because I matter, capital I, capital M. This is quite hard. And one of the things I'll just sort of add as a footnote that I struggle with a lot with this is the question of how do we get people to believe this as opposed to just think of it as a nice idea? You know, walk up to a child who's been abused by an emotionally abusive parent and say, oh, but God loves you infinitely and without condition. You're not going to get very far unless there's some kind of therapeutic process that makes it internalizable. So I think this is, I don't mean to sound Pollyannish, I think this is actually hard, but I think it also has the potential to be liberating. Now, so I am very torn, I have to say, Sharon, about this question. I get asked this question a lot, or versions of this question. So what is the secular version of this? So first of all, let me say, I don't think anyone is sure that there is a God, or they're kidding themselves both philosophically and existentially. I'm not sure there's a God. I believe there's a God, which depends on my not knowing that there's a God. I could say that a little clearer if I'm right. Faith depends on not knowing. Otherwise, it's not faith. I don't know that there is a God. I stake my life on really caring about that question and thinking that there probably is, or hoping that there is. That's another discussion, maybe. Here's what I'm torn about. I can't figure out whether I'm the right person to ask that question to. Meaning, what I have started saying to people who see themselves as atheists or non-theists, whatever it might be, is, well, you tell me, right? What does the Jewish tradition offer here that you can find a way to articulate without God language? I'm not totally sure that I'm the one who should be doing that for people, not because I don't feel, like, oh, it's not my job. I don't mean it like that. I just think, like, in other words, I want people to make Torah their own and not pre-digest it for them. Does that make sense? I mean, right? So, I will say that it's a really interesting question. One question that I find myself thinking about a lot is whether there is a secular analog to believing in the infinite worth of every human being that is unconditional and always already there. Some of you might be familiar with this, but in human rights theory, this is a very heated and ongoing debate because there are certain human rights theorists, Michael Perry is the most famous one, who basically argue, look, human rights is ineradicably religious. Where else can you ground the idea that every human being, prior to any political arrangement, has rights? Where do they come from? And most other human rights theorists who tend to be secular have basically said, you can't be right. Now, I don't know if he's right or he's not right. I'd like him to be wrong because I want everyone to care about human rights and because I'd like religious people who often use religion to thwart human rights to be more modest about their claims. But I'm not sure he's wrong. So I'm interested in hearing from non-believers how they construct this kind of worldview. And that is something I think is more fundamental. And now I will hand over the mic to you. I think it's really important in this day and age for religious thinkers not to be engaged in the project of trying to convince people of how the religious person's views are all right. I'm in favor of learning from each other. So much of conversation between religious and secular people historically has been about religious people assuming that they hold the truth and they are speaking to the benighted and sharing the truth. That's true about Orthodox Kira for the most part. It's true about Christian apologetics. I just feel like, first of all, it's not healthy for the spiritual life of the person who's preaching, who needs to have more humility than that. And it doesn't wrestle with the fact that we live in an incredibly ambiguous universe. I think there are really good reasons to believe and some really good reasons not to. So, when someone tells me that, I just want to be, well, tell me about how you experience the world.
I'm mindful of the time. I want to talk about that question for another 2 hours, but I think we should move on just because and the reason I ask the question, it's to say to a theologian, like, how does your work matter to people who don't believe in God is a hard way to start. But I think the reason why is because maybe one of the things that American Jews have internalized from the Protestantization of American Jewry, which is our desire to emulate Christianity while at the same time differentiating from Christianity, is that I think that we too have taken on faith and love of God, that's also for Christians and not for us. And I think it's important for us to be able to get our claws into ideas like the ideas in your book without immediately saying, well, this doesn't speak to me because I am not a person of faith. So I'm going to leave it at that, and just in the hopes that for people who are atheists, when you pick up the book and you start reading about God's love, do not put the book down. Keep reading, because there is so much that's here for you.
It was a kind of sort of concession, if you will, that the chapter on who is God appears at the end of the book rather than at the beginning, which is what I would have done if I was writing a book of theology for theologians. I start with the human because I think that's where most American Jews live. and that's totally understandable. And so I went out of the theological order for, I mean this in the best sense of this word, for pastoral reasons, for accessibility reasons, for trying to create a shared discourse among a wider swath of people with different perceptions of the world.
So I want to, little chutzpah, I want to try to go in and offer a pathway because it leads to a question for both of you. But I actually finished your book and then I reread it because I wanted to read it as though I were an atheist. And it works. Because what you do is you make an argument for a character in a body of literature named God. And things flow out of, if you're willing to have that character, you don't have to worry about how tall was Hamlet and what color hair did Hamlet have to be deeply, profoundly transformed by the play. It's a gripping play, not quite as good as Shai's book, but really something. And so what if you read it through, because what I realized is you don't base it on experience, you make arguments. And so you make arguments about the kind of world in which we orient ourselves in love, discipline ourselves in love, train ourselves in love. And those arguments work whether you're talking about a being named God, who is imperfectly contained in the literature, or a literary character God who flows throughout Jewish literature. The arguments work. If God is just a literary character, then we're saying, what would it look like to imagine a world in which all people have equal worth? I can imagine a secular biologist conceding that point. You don't have to say infinite worth. I don't know anywhere where the Jewish tradition says infinite worth, just says worth. And so, you know, if no person is worth more than any other person, every one of your teachings flows. But that led me to realize that my struggle was deeper than that, which is I grew up an atheist and I didn't come to God because of rational arguments for God. I got swept away at our alma mater. And that sweeping away was an experience of love so deep that I've never recovered. And so I've read all about this character that I encountered, but they're always people's take on what I encountered. They're not the encounter itself. And I think that puts me in the existentialist camp, and then it makes me a process person too. But what I want to ask you is, the book was a book about thinking about love and arguments about love. And I thought it was really valuable for people who've encountered love. But your other great influence, Heschel, when he wrote a book about Shabbat, I had a feeling that he was going to say, I want you who've never had a real Shabbat to know what the feeling feels like. And if I can do that, I'm not going to make an argument about Shabbat. I'm going to write a book in which you taste Shabbos. And that's going to make you want to go do something about it. And so I want to hear your thoughts, and then I want to hear your thoughts, if you don't mind, about love as experiential as opposed to love that is arrived at through cognitive discourse.
You know, it's really an interesting question because I don't totally recognize myself in the way that you just characterize it, because I do talk, you know, for better or for worse, I do talk in a certain kind of intellectually oriented way. But a lot of the things that I'm trying to talk about, I think, are very primal experiences. Like when I talk about what it means to live oriented by gratitude and to awaken with a sense that my life is a gift, the world is a gift, my life in the world is a gift inside of a gift, and what happens when I see my life and the world that way. That, to me, is deeply experiential. I'll say the nicest thing anyone, I think, has ever said to me about my teaching and writing, the point here is not to toot my own horn, the point here is to get at something that you're saying, is that Eric Alterman, himself a very insistently secular Jewish writer once said to me, I understand what you're up to. You're trying to get people to think deeply and feel deeply at the very same time. And I was like, wow, I feel seen. I really I feel like that is exactly my hope. I am a better writer about ideas than I am about evocation. I'm not really so good at that. Part of it, I have to say, is that having spent so much time writing about Heschel, I a little bit became suspicious of it. And so I'm very hesitant to go there. Also, I'm going to say something that is not going to sound loving. I have seen so many rabbis try to imitate Heschel so poorly. It's so hard to do. It's not their fault. It's just he had a certain kind of extraordinary gift in his fourth language to just evoke experiences for people. I don't think I have that gift. So sometimes it sounds more intellectual, but a lot of what I'm trying to ask in this book, for example, what would it mean to walk through the world and feel like, you know what? Your success is a source of joy to me. How liberating would that be? If I could see you in just, this is terrible, but I used to say to people, this is like what happens when you're young and brash. When people first applied for jobs at Hadar, I would sometimes say in the interview, if you're the kind of person who sees someone who has a similar job to you being recognized and appreciated, and that makes you feel good, I would love to see your application go further. If you're the kind of person who sees someone in a similar job to you be recognized, and you're kind of consumed with jealousy, now this is the part that was brash and inappropriate, there are 100 other Jewish organizations where you'll fit right in. So now that was an awful thing to say in retrospect, but honest, but awful. And so I guess, Brad, what I'm trying to say is I'm trying in a philosophical way to evoke what to me are some very primary experiences. I'll just give one more example of this that is very important to me, and I have to say it's been on my mind more and more since I finished the book, which is love as a way of seeing. What happens when you aspire to see other people the way you think God sees them? Of course, then it raises important questions about what kind of God do you believe in, right? But I think about this all the time as a daily experiential challenge. The guy who drives me crazy. Is my narrative about them, he's just totally insufferable? Or is my narrative about them, this is a person who's infinitely precious. And by the way, you don't know what burden he's carrying. You don't know that. Or maybe you do and you're choosing not to. I am certainly nobody's role model for this, but I do find this idea of love as training our eyes to see in certain ways really powerful. And I understand why one might see that as an argument, but it's not an argument, really. It's a discipline. It's a spiritual practice. If you prefer, it's an aspiration, something more like that.
I want to do some applied theology for a moment, if we can, because you wrote this book, and I know you closed this manuscript probably well over a year ago. The world that the book comes into is a different world than any of us could have envisioned. Even the title is provocative in some ways right now. Judaism is about love. And you write about protest, about the power and necessity of social protest. You quote Walter Brueggemann, am I saying Brueggemann, saying that the power of protest is that it awakens the social imagination. You write about this week's parsha, about V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And you say that actually, counterintuitively for some of us, the neighbor is your Jewish neighbor, right, is a fellow Jew. But that doesn't mean we're only obligated to love our fellow Jews, because we also have an obligation to love the ger, to love the stranger, which is precisely the person who's outside the community. I have been thinking in this moment of protest and counter-protest that the claim that we are called to love our Jewish family and also to love and care about human beings who are suffering profoundly outside our Jewish family is profoundly counterintuitive and might even be biological in some way. Like maybe there's something about our biology that makes it so hard for people to hold both of those truths. And you argue very powerfully that actually holding both of those is essential and deeply Jewish. And so what that would mean is that we have to be both protester and counter-protester simultaneously. And I'm wondering if you can help us enter this time and space that we're in right now, which is so fraught, with some really deep, loving Torah about who we're called to love when things get really hard.
She really does pitch softballs, doesn't she? That's always been the thing about Sharon's Torah. It's very light. Brous light, exactly. Well played, well played. I want to start in what's going to seem like a faraway place and then back into your answer. I want to share something very personal, which is that I've been working on this book for a long time, and there were a lot of obstacles along the way, living with chronic illness, about with cancer, like a lot. And the galleys arrived at my home on Saturday morning, October 14th. And I turned to Rachel, my wife, and I said, I don't care about this book at all. And she sort of looked at me sadly and didn't really know what to say. And it took me, if you've ever written a book, you know how crazy this is, it took me 4 days to open the box. I just couldn't do it because I felt like love, I don't want to talk about love. I just want to cry all the time. And then something really interesting started to happen, which is I started talking to colleagues and students about how I felt totally indifferent to my book, to my life's work in many ways. And quite a number of them said to me something that really took me aback. They said, you have this exactly backwards. I want to talk about love right now more than I ever have in my life. And I have to say that the first few people who said it to me, I was like, well, that sounds lovely, but I am not there. Like, I don't feel at all what you're describing. And then enough people started saying it to me that it awakened something in me. And then I had this moment in which I realized that consciously or not, they were channeling a piece of deep wisdom in the Jewish tradition that I tried to kind of mine in this book, which is that, as you know, the 9th day of Av, Tisha B'Av, is the day when we mourn everything horrible that ever befell the Jewish people. So the temples, first temple, second temple, the generation of the Exodus, learning they wouldn't enter the land, everything horrible happens on Tisha B'Av. And we read the book of IKAR, Lamentations, and it's utterly desolating and devastating. It's an impossible book to live with. But then the Mishnah that tells us about Tisha B'Av, 2 Mishnahs later, tells us that the 15th day of Av was one of the 2 happiest days of the year, Tu B'Av. And that is because on that day, couples would meet and marry off, or couple off. And I remembered years ago reading that Mishnah and thinking, this is the most bizarre thing in the world. You want to have a festival of love in Judaism? Maybe wait till Shiva for the temple is over? Why are you inserting a festival of love 6 days after the whole world fell apart? And I realized that the answer, I think, is that the sages are actually tapping into something incredibly beautiful and profound. They're basically saying, just when trauma threatens to shut you down completely and closes you off and constricts you even physically, the answer is more love. Let's make couples. It's great, every Jewish grandmother's dream Mishnah. Let's make couples. Our whole world has been destroyed. Is he single? Right? So So I realized that when people were saying to me, oh, I want to talk about love now, they were channeling something really profound in the tradition itself, which is in the moment when it felt, I mean, so many Jews feel unloved, abandoned. Other people feel other things. I'm not trying here, I'm not giving some political speech here, but there was so much raw feeling and pain, and the idea of gripping love precisely then feels like a kind of spiritual heroism to me that the tradition asks us for. It's both a balm and a challenge at the same time. Now, who are we supposed to love? So, I would say that in a nutshell, the argument that I try to make, well, I'll say it first in the language of the book. Judaism is not particularism or universalism, it's particularist universalism. And that means, to put it in a different way, that Jewish ethics works with the grain of nature rather than against it. It recognizes that love starts local. I learn love in a family, ideally. I love my children more than I love your children, even though I'm supposed to love your children too. The risk that Judaism takes in doing this is that family first all too often devolves into family only, right? But the answer to that is not, therefore, skip over all local attachments. Because someone who just loves everyone the same doesn't end up loving anyone in particular, right? So I think that, what I try to say is that, yeah, we're supposed to love our community first, and not only. And this is hard work. And, so what I would say concretely about this time that we're in is that on the one hand, I think it is totally natural and ethically defensible in a moment of trauma and devastation to turn towards one's family first. And we are never at liberty to renounce compassion for other people and their suffering. And to go to a major theme of one of the chapters of this book, dehumanization is always a crime, no matter how tempting. It is always a crime. And by the way, it is not only a crime because you dehumanize other people or what you do to them, but it's also a crime because you give yourself a moral blank check when you do that. The moment you dehumanize people, right, they don't make a claim on you. And what I would really say ultimately, if we're kind of alluding to the conflict unfolding at this moment, is that the tragedy is that although we're farther away from this, it seems, than we ever have been, if the land of Israel is ever going to become less soaked with blood, it will come from two peoples cultivating empathy for one another's suffering and sympathy for one another's stories, precisely where we're not right now. There was a figure in Israel who's sort of one of my heroes, and if you don't know a lot about Israeli history, this may kind of be surprising. His name was Moshe Una. Moshe Una, just take this in for a second. Moshe Una was a member of parliament for the National Religious Party, the Mafdal, and the founder of the religious Zionist peace movement, Oz V'Shalom. That in itself, right? Imagine, this is the party of Smotrich and Ben Gvir, right? And he's founding a religious Zionist peace movement. He was an educator by training, a German Ole, a German immigrant to Israel. And in one of his speeches, he says something that is just so simple in its power. The essay is about what he calls chinuch lamoledet, educating for our heritage. And he says, the first task of educating for our heritage is teaching our children to love this land. It is the place we dreamed of. It is the place that our ancestors lived. It is the place where God's commandments can be fulfilled. It is everything to us. That's the first dimension of chinuch lamoledet. And then he says, but there's a second dimension of chinuch lamoledet, of educating for our heritage. And that is to teach our children that there is another people who feels about this place exactly the same way we do. I just find, I go back to that and it's just so heartbreaking. And, the tragedy of protests and counter-protests, nobody's talking like that now. Nobody. You don't see college kids running around saying mutual empathy, two lands for two states for two peoples. You don't see that at all, right? And we can talk about why even, but I think that neither Jews in Israel nor Palestinians are going anywhere. So at the end of the day, you can decide we're all going to kill each other, or we're going to learn to exercise an empathy muscle and insistently see each other's humanity. It is a choice. Hard one, but it is a choice.
Thank you. So we have talked for about an hour, and it's your own fault. You put 3 rabbis in the front of the room. What were you expecting? But we did want to give you a chance to ask questions of this wonderful colleagues. So with your permission, colleagues, yes, please.
Thank you.
And sorry, let me just say, I want to remind everyone how to ask a question, which is short and concise, and it ends with a question mark. And please introduce yourselves before you do.
My question is just curious, when you now go on the road and speak to Christian audiences, namely, what is the reception of reading the book, hearing about the book? How do they respond?
Well, so I think that it's worth saying that the crowd that is hearing me is very self-selected, right? I think that's important to sort of just underscore that. So that's a combination of I've been visiting Christian seminaries and recording a lot of Christian podcasts. And I think that one of the things that I've been really struck by is how many times I've encountered a sense of shame among Christians for the ways that they have contributed to the dehumanization of Jews, but then understanding from my talking that they've even skewed the way Jews see themselves. You know, I had an experience, it's like a strange thing to share, but I had an experience a couple of weeks ago that I'm still trying to take in. I was recording a radio show and podcast by a guy who I think is like moderate evangelical. I imagine non-Trumpist, but also not a Democrat, let's say, right? I'm just trying to place him in the right. And he begins, deep Southern accent, and he begins by saying, Rabbi, before we start talking, I just want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for 2,000 years of brutalizing and dehumanizing and saying the most awful things. I'm really just sorry. I was like very taken aback, and part of me, of course, given that I'm a Jew, was like, do you have the authority to be apologizing on behalf of Christianity? Right? Like, you know, right? It's like, but like, it was very, very moving. I think, this may sound like really inside baseball, but the most interesting critique I've received of my book so far has been from several Christian theologians who have told me, you know, in an unconscious way, your default portrayal of Christianity is Lutheran, because that's a really interesting foil for developing rabbinics. But I, as a Catholic, don't really recognize my Christianity in that. And that's been really interesting to me to take on and think about. You know, for example, I talk in the book about Martin Luther's insistence that law and love are dichotomized, and actually show how in Judaism, law is a manifestation of love rather than an alternative to it. And, you know, this one Catholic theologian said to me, I'm on your side of this divide, right? I mean, we have a canon law tradition that is pretty damn serious, right? And then a different friend of mine called me and said, as a Wesleyan, you sound too Lutheran to me. It was very, very interesting. And I'm sort of trying to take that on because it was not a conscious process at all. Although it is true that the first Christian theologians I read seriously were Augustine and Martin Luther, who are a very particular strand of Christian thinking. I don't know if I'm even remotely answering the question that you were asking, but that wouldn't be the first time. Yeah, okay, I'll let me stop there. Yeah, please.
Hi, Sean Landris. So this is a question for both Rabbi Brous and Rabbi Held. I think,
But not for you, Brett.
but well, I assume that Rabbi Artson will take the privilege of answering it as well. But it strikes me that your two books are at some level complements to each other, because one is about ecclesiology and the other is about theology. And Rabbi Brous will remember that like 20 years ago, we were in a room where an evangelical pastor challenged a group of congregational rabbis with the notion of saying to everybody, God loves you, which of course presumes that God knows who we are and actually cares about a person specifically. What do you think, and congregational rabbis are on the front lines of these challenges, as we read about in Rabbi Brous's book. As a matter of Jewish communal thinking, why did it take 20 years for a theological manifesto that expresses what congregational rabbis have been talking about for a long time? And what is it, how do we do this ecclesiology, conversely, in the absence of a theology? It feels like there's like a time warp that both these books are trying to close. And I'd love to hear you think about how we put those pieces together. And I'm sure Rabbi Artson has thoughts about that, because he's been in the trenches for these issues a long time.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually like a series of kind of nettlesome questions that I'm not totally sure how to answer. But let me try. Which is why, by the way, just if you were wondering why Sharon let me go first, it was not hospitality. It was like, give me a few minutes to think. It was, right?
I know Sean's question.
Right. You know, I have to say I'm a little surprised by your suggestion, Sean, that rabbis have been talking about this for 20 years. I think the rabbi that you live with has been talking about this for 20 years. I'm not sure rabbis writ large have been talking about this for 20 years. First of all, I'm not sure a lot of rabbis feel safe talking about God, let alone about God's love, right? So, you know, one of the things, in some ways, you know, this is a strange, I've never said this out loud before, but here I go. There's two ways, I think, to go about helping American Jews begin to talk about God. One is to sort of facilitate a kind of, what do you think about God? You know, pull out a piece of paper and share your metaphor for God. And I respect that and I value that. I'm trying to do something very different from that, which is to model what I think it could mean to have a self-critical, self-doubting conversation rooted in the sources of Judaism. My expectation is not that everyone is going to walk out of here saying, okay, theologically, I think exactly what he thinks. My hope is that it actually gets people to say, well, I think I might think about that a little differently, right? It's not by just sort of open-ended facilitation, it's by modeling and presenting. Part of that has to do with my own traditionalist bent, but part of it is that also feels sort of more authentic to me as a way of creating conversation, which is Jews talk to their ancestors. That's just what we do. Why did it take so long? I mean, you know, it's funny. It's not that it took 20 years till we responded to that Christian minister. It maybe took us 2,000 years to get out from under what Christianity said about us. A friend of mine emailed me the other day and said, try this one on for size. Your book is an act of decolonization. Right? You are actually saying, what happens to Jewish theology when it gets out from under the glare and the control of Christianity? It's a really interesting comment, because other people have said to me, no, you're letting Christians define the terms. That's why you're talking about love. And I'm like, no, I really don't think that's true, because Deuteronomy was before Jesus, right? I don't think that, right, that doesn't feel quite right to me. But that observation, I think, is interesting. I think, in other words, it's taken us a very long time to get out from under a story others told about us that, again, to go back to where we started, we had largely internalized. And look, we didn't, I mean, generations of in ways that I find baffling, generations of American Jews went to shul and rarely heard about God. Like, imagine I give you a Dostoevsky novel, and say, listen, every weekend get together with your friends and talk about this, but with one caveat. You may never mention the main character. This is a bizarre thing that we've done to ourselves and to our culture. And so I think it's like time to come out from under that. Sharon,
Yeah, I'm just thinking about Rabbi David Kasher's incredible Kol Nidre sermon from a couple years ago, in which you described your relationship with God and how you had this revelation on the highway, I think right after your father's death. And you described it in a way that matches some of the fire and magnetism of your description of falling in love with God. And I felt like it was such a gift that you gave us when you offered that sermon, to just be willing to share the depth of that connection, to invite us to think about what it might look like to have that kind of connection. I remember that you and I, many years ago, were in a small meeting with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who I feel his name should be mentioned here, since he's one of the great teachers of our time, and I think one of the most important teachers of Rabbi Held, and also of me, and I imagine of you too, Rabbi Artson. And we were having this conversation with him because some donor said to us, we need to write a new story for the Jewish people that's going to be a narrative that will compel people to care about Judaism. And I remember saying, we have a really good story. We just don't tell it enough. And at some point, Yitz pulled me aside and he said, I just want to ask you, and it was just a couple years after IKAR started, but he said, I've been reading about what you guys are doing out there in LA. And he said, how'd you do it? Like, how did you make young people want to go to shul and like make Shabbos joyous for people who don't, like observe Shabbat? And I was so stunned by the question. And I said, honestly, Yitz, I just take you really seriously. Like, I took your theology and embedded it in my heart and then shared it with the community in a way where people don't have to say at the door if they agree with the full theological treatise behind it. They just have to know that in this place, we love each other. And we believe it's our obligation to love the world, and that's the greatest manifestation of Torah and of God and of who we are in the world. And so I think that part of what's happening here with this like theology versus ecclesiology, like practitioner versus scholar or theologian, is that the way we have trained ourselves to treat each other as though we are all images of God, or we strive to treat each other as though we are all images of God, because that is foundational to who we are. And to my initial question to you, like, even the people who don't believe in God at all understand the value and the virtue of treating and being treated as though we are all created in the image of God. And so I think that's part of the way that, like, trying to embody the message of this means trying to embody the love itself. And we can manifest that even without the third of the book that is footnotes, right? Like this is going to make the case and then prove the point. But really, it's about us learning to internalize the message here, which is as you said, and I, by the way, shared this under a chuppah in your name, that we are all recipients of the act of grace that is life itself from God. Once we receive grace, the only reasonable thing to do is experience life with gratitude, and then that gratitude transforms into acts of generosity and love to others. It doesn't just live inside of us, but it must manifest. Am I sharing your Torah well enough? I've made a living out of that. In your name, always. But I think that's the idea. Is if we can receive the sense of grace, then we can be filled with gratitude and manifest that generosity in our efforts to try to build a more just and loving community and society and world.
I know you really wanted me to respond, so I'm gonna. One of the things that happened to Jewish life in the process of modernizing is we bifurcated ourselves from what appeared to be crazy and dangerous and what seemed too much like the neighbors. So they're about love, we're about law. We kind of bought into that. But I think the other thing we did is we decided mysticism was deadly, because it was for a while. And so the Judaism I grew up with had been stripped of all mysticism. It had also been stripped of all poetry, right? So the idea that there's a rich mystical tradition that was mainstream, the same rabbis who brought us the Mishnah brought us Hechalot Rabbati and brought us mystical texts. If you read the Zohar, you will be awash in love. There's an upper mother, there's a lower mother. The lower mother receives the influx from the upper, I mean, it's you know, Torah erotica, and it's predicated on a very dynamic, earth-changing love in which we are on a mission. Our mission is to gather the sparks and then through our own love to return them to the source. So I think only a Judaism that is decolonized, that is willing to say we are going to embrace the fullness of our sources, is going to be one that's going to be at home with love at the core, in which love is not dichotomous from obligations or responsibilities or behavioral manifestations. It becomes an organic expression of ourselves. But then I also need to defend my great-grandfather, not biologically, Solomon Schechter. His essay on the Jews of Sfat is a program of love. And his book of Jewish theology has love coursing through it. And my real father, Sadia Gaon, 9th century Baghdadi, I mean, he talks about God's love for the Jewish people manifesting in Torah. The Torah is itself the ultimate gift of love. So I think the real precise question is, why did Western Ashkenazic Jews become so derooted from the fullness of our own sources that we misperceived Judaism to be sterile and formulaic, and we placed our faith in a kind of thin rationality? And I agree that what Shai in his way has been doing through his whole career, his teaching and his writings, and certainly what Sharon has done in her teachings and writings and in the institution that she has fashioned in her image, is to bring about the reunification, so that Solomon Schechter used to say, nothing Jewish is alien to me, right? And that was a battle cry. If you read Jewish medieval poetry, my God, these guys can barely contain their eros. They are in love with everything. And it becomes religious poetry and secular poetry that you couldn't say in shul without getting people scandalized these days. Like, it's awash in erotic love and love. So I want to say that the deviation is this modern 200-year bifurcation that made it shallow and brittle. And in a sense, there's been a lot of people, Buber, Rosenzweig, a lot of people for a long time have been chipping away at that, banging away at that. And this, in a sense, has a great lineage. This has been a wonderful evening, and I've been told that we can't ask any more questions, so don't blame me for cutting it off right now. But I can't say no to you.
I'm just gonna, I just want to ask, I'm saying Kaddish, and I know there are others in here who are as well. And so when we're done, folks will have an opportunity to meet Rabbi Held and to buy the book, and I hope you all will. And it's a wonderful gift also to give to loved ones. And you can sign the books over here. We're going to meet right here for Mariv for a quick evening service so that we can say Mourner's Kaddish together. And I just want to thank all of you for coming out tonight for this beautiful conversation. There's so much more that we need to talk about here to understand both the past, but also the present, and to dream together about the future. And I'm so deeply grateful to you for taking the time and effort and love that you took in order to write this book. And I know that it was an incredibly challenging past several years. And this is an extraordinary feat, and the world will be better for it. And I'm so moved, Shai, by your friendship and by your love and by this incredible work. And Rabbi Brad Artson, thank you you so much for guiding us as always. There's a whole generation of students and rabbis in the world who have been totally shaped by these two teachers, and we're all better off for it. So I thank you all so much. And thank you to the AJU and to IKAR for helping this make this evening happen. We're really grateful to all of you.